This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is May 1st, 2021, and I'm producer Pat. This week, the entire show is a deep dive by Darren into the ideas in the book Just Desserts by Dennett and Gregg Caruso. The book is a debate between the two philosophers regarding their views on things like free will, moral responsibility, and legal punishment. Darren was with Adam when this was recorded, and their conversation was quite interesting, so we thought we'd release it as the full show. I hope you enjoy it and that everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
Longtime listeners are likely aware I'm a huge fan of philosopher Dennett, so I was happy to see him release another book, this time in the format of a debate with fellow philosopher Gregg Caruso. In this segment, I'll provide an overview of their book, some greater exploration of their arguments, some issues I had with the book, and then overall thoughts about the book. This book, by the way, is called Just Desserts, and it's about free will. It is definitely about free will, but what makes it a bit more complicated is both about the implications of certain ideas or stances, and about what words do mean and what they should mean. Common territory for most philosophers, but it can be frustrating to have these two different debates intertwined, even worse when it isn't just about one word, but several or even foundational definitions.
Yeah, when people talk about free will, they're often like agreeing on the basic principles and just disagreeing about semantics. It's
right, so it's not quite that, although it is partly that.
Yeah.
In preparation for this segment, I happened to reread the back cover of the book, a physical book that I actually read versus listened to, and thought they provided a nice overall summary, like a good publisher should. So I'm going to quote what it says. Just Desserts, 1S, brings together two philosophers, Daniel C. Dennett and Gregg D. Caruso, to debate their respective views on free will, moral responsibility, and legal punishment. In 3 extended conversations, Dennett and Caruso present their arguments for and against the existence of free will and debate their implications. Dennett argues that the kind of free will required for moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. For him, self-control is key. We are not responsible for becoming responsible, but we are responsible for staying responsible, for keeping would-be puppeteers at bay.
Interesting.
Caruso takes the opposite view, arguing that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, and because of this we are never morally responsible for our actions in the sense that would make us truly deserving, that's in italics, of blame and praise, punishment and reward. End quote.
Okay.
I'll unpack various aspects of that in turn.
Both of them agree that determinism is a real thing. So in that sense, both of them think free will doesn't exist in the way some people
taking the words right out of my mouth.
Sorry.
So this is my note. Both Dennett and Caruso don't have a firm belief on whether the universe is deterministic or not, but both follow a generally scientific worldview, so it is mainly one or the other, meaning it's either deterministic or it's not.
Okay.
Both think that indeterminism doesn't get you anything like free will, regardless of how you define it, pretty much, right?
Sure. So if there's some quantum effect that means that things are unpredictable, it doesn't really change.
Yes. So some libertarian free will people are like, well, there's some randomness. Like, why would randomness give you more freedom? It makes sense at all.
Yeah.
So in contrast, though, Dennett does think free will is compatible with determinism, while Caruso does not. I'm just trying to say that technically in this debate, they are both agnostic about whether the world is deterministic, but for the debate, in practice, you could say Dennett is a compatibilist with determinism being true and free will being compatible with determinism, and Caruso saying free will doesn't work with either determinism or indeterminism, but we can also just play it along with determinism being true. What does free will even mean here? Well, that's part of the debate. Yeah. Caruso offers a definition at the very beginning to ground us all, and even a little glossary, that links free will with moral responsibility and having control in the actions you take. This is the concept of basic desert, which is what philosophers call it, which means you are responsible because you're the person who did the thing and you had control of your actions. Caruso thinks this describes the heart of the issue and how it is generally defined in the literature. Dennett really doesn't like this definition, largely because of the word control, but also because it offers more support to defining free will in a way that it doesn't exist. Yes, there's a more specific definition. I was trying not to get too much into the details, but Caruso is saying like, well, free will is the thing that really makes you morally responsible in a very precise way because you have so much freedom. you did the thing, therefore it's your fault, so to speak. And then it's like, well, you're kind of hedging words in a certain way and you've made it such that free will doesn't exist, but that's not the free will I'm interested in. As Dennett's earlier book said, there's varieties of free will worth wanting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So going back to the quote from above, Dennett argues that the kind of free will required for moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. For him, self-control is key. We are not responsible for becoming responsible, but we are responsible for staying responsible for keeping would-be puppeteers at bay. Taking each part in turn, Dennett agrees that the history of the universe led to your existence, that you didn't choose your parents, your country of birth, your upbringing, so we had little to do with the initial creation of ourselves and our early development. Dennett thinks that these differences in starting point average out over a lifetime, meaning some people have more fortunate circumstances, some people have less, but over lifetime, they kind of average out. As well, he argues that we do create ourselves based on the actions we take and the choices we make, starting from a young age. Through the process of development, most of us become part of, he calls it the Moral Agents Club. And this is a club you definitely want to be a member of. While we will be held accountable for wrongdoing if we're in this club, we also get to participate in society, having freedoms to act like mature agents do, and we can receive praise for our good deeds. Meaning, if you're part of the Moral Agents Club, yes, if you do something wrong, you get punished, but you get to actually be treated as if you can do things. You can sign contracts. You can buy things. You can have autonomy. This is what generally people want. And his thought is like, you can't really have one without the other.
Sure.
Evolution and our development has enabled us to control our actions to a sufficient extent that we can be said to be the locus of responsibility for them. This is an important point. So when you say you can't avoid anything, which is what some people say, it's like, well, if you throw something at my head and I duck, I've then avoided it. That's what we mean by the word avoided. He's like, well, no, we mean like actual avoided. It's like, well, that doesn't even make sense. Yeah. Otherwise, why would you define it that way? Similarly, when you talk about controlling your actions, we all know there's some people that can control their actions better than others. And quite frankly, most adults can control their actions better than most children. And that's why children are not yet fully part of the Moral Agents Club. Yeah. Similarly, if you have various disabilities or mental issues, you may not be a fully formed moral agent. And as such, society recognizes that and treats you differently. That's what you kind of don't want because you want the upsides of being treated like a moral agent.
This is where like powers of attorney and legal responsibility and all sorts of things come into it.
Because sometimes we think, well, this person, when say they're 4 years old,
yes,
they maybe are twice as smart as that dog now in terms of communications from several episodes ago. But the issue being that we don't allow 4-year-olds to determine their lives because we don't think they're going to be that good at it.
No, my daughter's not signing any contracts.
Nope.
And I wouldn't want her to.
No, exactly. I mean, there are some parents that are probably worse than some 4-year-olds, but on the whole, right, we have a good reason for this.
Yeah.
When he is more engaged, which isn't always, Dennett writes well and in a convincing manner. Even though this is clearly a discussion which was across 3 different conversations, typing back and forth at each other, I assume, it seems like sometimes he's a reluctant participant. It's like, well, you said you're going to have a fruitful debate, kind of act like it. Versus Gregg bugging Dennett to talk about these things. Sometimes that's the vibe I got. Okay, so shifting a bit, repeating the description of Caruso from the book jacket, Caruso takes the opposite view, arguing that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And because of this, we are never morally responsible for our actions in the sense that would make us truly deserving of blame and praise, punishment and reward. Looking at that first part, what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. Again, ultimately is a key phrase here, which Dennett might even agree with the word ultimately, like, well, the Big Bang happened. That was ultimately responsible, but do we really even care about that? More precisely, Caruso argues that luck is extremely important. In fact, and he quotes someone else, luck swallows all. And he breaks it down. There's constitutive luck, which is the luck that goes into all the things that led you to being you. And then there is present luck, the luck of the moment, whether things, in the broadest sense, break your way. It all comes down to luck. How could it not be both these things interacting with each other that leads to all the things that you have and do and be and are? This is what Caruso is arguing. And he thinks that Dennett is undervaluing luck because we have lots of evidence that indicates if you are starting from a lower socioeconomic status, it is much, much more difficult to have a better life compared to someone with more advantages.
Oh, yes.
This seems obviously true to me. When one thinks about matters globally, it seems staggeringly true. Dennett never really addressed this problem with his view, and I thought that was pretty frustrating. It's like, luck averages out, like, people in slavery, it doesn't average out. What are you talking about? It's ridiculous.
No, this is your circumstances of birth. And yeah, and there's a whole debate about, it's meritocracy and it's pull up your bootstraps and things like that. And that's a factor in success.
Yes.
And that's a factor in a lot of things, but it's not the whole story, right?
Right. So if it's all luck, how can I be held morally responsible for anything? right? That's what Caruso is also implying.
Yeah.
Well, you can, Caruso argues, but not in the basic desert sense. And this is where more of the philosophy comes in. Moral responsibility is a broader term and can be understood in various ways. Caruso definitely thinks we can and should hold people morally responsible, but in a way that is more like moral accountability or answerability. This is other philosophical jargon that comes in. Okay. Not in the basic desert sense, as the basic desert sense has too many links to notion of retribution.
Oh, yes.
So not truly in quotes, but still to be held accountable. Remember, because the line was, again, the sneaky thing, truly deserving of blame and praise, which is different than you can be accountable or answerable for your actions, but not deserving of it in the retribution sense.
How does that functionally change at the end of the day?
Well, so depending on how you define things, it might, right?
Yes.
So I think this is a nice segue to the topic of punishment, which takes up a large chunk of the book.
Yes.
Both in its relation to free will and because Caruso presents his quarantine model of dealing with wrongdoing. Things get a bit complicated and frustrating. They both seem to be forward-looking in the consequentialistic sense regarding any sort of sanctioning in their views. Meaning, if someone's done something wrong, they should be treated as if they've done something wrong because it has beneficial forward-looking effects. Not because it's backward-looking, which is usually retribution,
yes.
which I think, quite frankly, is how a lot of society still functions. Yes. When someone does something wrong, it's because they're a bad person, and yes. bad people deserve to be punished because they're bad.
But yeah, that's sort of our visceral instinct in relation to actions, and it's not always the best way to reform people and to have others avoid an action based on what they perceive is being done as a punishment to others, right?
Exactly. So, quickly, broadly, usually why someone might be sanctioned by society, it has to do with retribution, punish them because they're bad, did something bad. Yep. It could have to do with deterrence, meaning either for them or others. It could have with removal. Just you want to remove someone from a situation or society because they are a threat, and some other ones. So this is mainly, they kind of agree on some of this stuff, right? But with the punishment angle, it gets a bit more complicated. So based on what I was saying about forward-looking sense, if someone is to be held accountable for their crimes, it should be because it has positive consequences in the world, not because the person truly deserves retributive punishment.
Yep.
But then Dennett says some things that make it sound like someone should be punished in that way that he just said he doesn't agree with. So Caruso calls him out on it, and then Dennett denies it. It's a very interesting thing, because Dennett's like, I'm not at all retributivist, and I'm forward-looking and consequentialistic. And Caruso's like, okay. And then Dennett's like, and someone needs to be punished. And he's like, why? But you keep saying this. And they kind of go back and forth. Dennett denies it, as I said. It seems to make sense. And then Dennett says that the person who did the wrong thing is the person that should be punished for the sanctity of the entire system. You're like, okay, well, that's a different level, right?
Sure.
That's a more broader societal deterrence aspect of it, right?
Yes.
I thought the logic here might be that humans have a need, a visceral need, as Adam just hinted, for retribution, and we wouldn't accept a system of justice that doesn't offer it. Even if we disagree with it intellectually, we viscerally think people need to be punished. So like in a consequentialistic, analytical sense, you're like, okay, punishment's not really legitimate, but people want it so much, we have to give a little bit of it. But that's not what the debate really was.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, Caruso seems more willing to explain how concepts are understood and often goes out of his way to try to understand Dennett's points of view. So if you were coming to this as a more neophyte, Caruso is helping you with language, he's defining terms, he's explaining why if you make move A, the response might be move B. Dennett doesn't seem to do this as much. For example, Caruso explains that punishment is typically defined, again, in literature, because people have debates about these things, as intentional harm caused by the state for a wrong action. And then it can be further broken down into positive aspects of punishment and negative aspects of punishment. And this just shows you like, oh, it really matters what words mean.
Sorry,
right?
What's the positive impact of the punishment and the negative impact of the punishment? Is that what we mean by that?
No, definitions. Like there's a positive punishment and a negative punishment, and they mean different things.
Okay.
I'm not going to go into that detail here, but just highlighting that in casual conversation, people use words differently than people who study things do.
Sure.
In some way, everyone knows this. Yes. When molecular biology comes up, no one's like, oh, well, I know what we mean by gabapentin and other things, and some people might be using a different definition. Like, no, that's not what happens, or the Krebs cycle. No, but because certain disciplines use words that so-called average people know. They think that they're using them the same way and they're often not. Or realizing that there's a nuance, sophistication, and complexity to the language and the words and the arguments that is not obvious until you've looked into it. And that was useful. That Caruso highlighted like, oh yes, so when I say punishment, what exactly do I mean?
Yes.
How is it currently understood? Do I disagree with that definition? And, it just shows how much homework one must have to do if they want to have opinions on things.
Well, opinions are easy.
Well, yes.
No one's gonna respect them.
Yes.
Or
How
they're
about
not gonna be worth anything.
decent opinions by people who know more than you do? Dennett seems less willing to engage in general and doesn't want to play the game of having a logically thorough and coherent stance on an issue. That's not entirely fair, but you get senses of that. Or Dennett sort of does this, but he thinks the real world is a bit too messy and labels can be limiting, which is also true. Because often they say, like, are you with this? Are you with that? Right? Oh, if you're a utilitarian, like a rule utilitarian or a contract utilitarian, or that, it's like, well, what if you're a bit of both? What if there's 5 different ways of looking at something and you feel some sympathy with all of them, right? So I do identify with some of Dennett's view, but Caruso is at least seem to be trying harder to figure these things out. A good example is when Caruso offers 5 different types of compatibilism. Like compatibilist 1 might be this, and he sort of talks about how this idea of compatibilism might relate to punishment and reward. And he said, well, Dennett, you seem like you're like a number 5 to me. And Dennett's like, well, I'm not really any of those. But then Dennett doesn't say which one he is. Or he doesn't offer a 6th version. And you're like, come on. When someone's really trying to understand your point of view and they outline this, please choose one or let me know how it doesn't fit. And you're just like, meh, doesn't really, no.
I'm a 2 with a side of 6.
Well, at least something, right? That said... Caruso thinks he can avoid retributive punishment by having a different way of looking at how we hold people accountable. This is his quarantine model, and the idea is that instead of seeing someone who's committed a crime as a bad person who did a bad thing, you adopt more of a framework of a health quarantine model. Meaning, if someone is likely to infect others with disease, you hold them accountable, but not in a just desserts morally responsible sense like they're bad people. Right? Oh. So if someone happens to have Ebola or even COVID, we'll say, we might quarantine them. We might limit their movements. We might sanction them if they, leave quarantine. But it's not because they're a bad person, right? They haven't done the bad thing in the ultimate justice sense. It just so happens luck dealt them a bad hand, and now they are potentially harmful to others, and that potential harm justifies harm to them. Harm in the broadest sense, like we restrict their movements, not like I'm saying punching them in the face. Harm to them in the broadest sense because it's like self-defense. So so Caruso is trying to say why we quarantine people can be justified on self-defense grounds because the person might harm me. Right? The state is imposing a sanction on the person by restricting their movement and quarantining them against their wishes most of the time, right?
Yes.
And that is a harm to that person, and that's justified not on retribution grounds, not even on consequentialistic grounds, but on the justification of self-defense from others.
So he's viewing imprisonment being similar to quarantine.
He's suggesting we adopt the general lens. And I'm sympathetic to this because it does try to remove I honestly think people have a belief that like someone's soul is bad.
Yes.
That person's soul is corrupt and they deserve to be punished. Now, they wouldn't say it out loud. Well, some might, but I think most people wouldn't say it out loud. But I think the background culture thinks this way, especially when we get into like, if someone's dealing with poverty and addiction issues. And then the flip side, of course, if someone's successful, they're a self-made man. You're like, that's not true either. A lot of it's luck. That said, Dennett thinks this won't really work. And the quarantine system currently works because it's backed by the coercive power of the state, which can punish in the way that Caruso doesn't like, and this would have trouble in practice. And I found it hard to disagree with Dennett here.
Well, how is it his quarantine he can call it quarantine and it could be functionally no different from the current prison system, right? Like, what exactly
yes. So a nuance there is that both of them think the current, because they're Americans, the U.S. prison system is terrible and needs tons of reform and there's many abuses, independent of free will, anything, it's terrible.
Yes.
And so maybe it is something like, I think he mentions Norway, where people are actually treated as if they're going to be rehabilitated. Their living conditions are not terrible.
Yes.
And because like as someone said, like most people go to prison, they get out. So what's your plan? Did you want to make them actually better people?
Absolutely.
What was your plan here?
Yes.
So they do disagree about these different types of things, but Dennett's point of view is that you can use this quarantine language all you want, but behind it is, and if you don't do it, we're going to punish you. And
and he'll that deterrence.
Well, that's Dennett's point, yes. And it's hard. I felt it hard not to agree. Like, we don't have to do this, and there are other domains where there's like tort law and civil lawsuits that can be used against people if we feel there's some other issues. And then like, well, what if someone doesn't want to pay the fine? What are you going to do? Do you then quarantine them? And there's more, complicated. It's like, well, what if I, pretend quarantine is okay, or I'm willing to go along with it, even though I'm like evilly inclined, so to speak. And I'm sympathetic to Gregg wanting to have a different framework for how we even think about the problem, but also Dennett saying, oh yeah, I think you probably need punishment in there somewhere. But what does punishment mean, right? Well, not because they're bad in a just desert sense, but because there needs to be some sort of coercive power. That said, again, Gregg was like, well, punishment is the just desert sense. And this is why I said it's frustrating, because they'll say, I agree, I don't agree. And sometimes they're using the very word differently.
Well, it's hard to conceptualize, but ideally, not sort of in a broken, terrible prison system, but ideally, a reaction to a crime can be better for the person that's being enacted against, right?
Yes.
If someone commits a violent crime, and the intervention helps them to become a better, less violent person, and then they haven't killed somebody, well, the rest of their life will be better. Whereas if that intervention didn't occur and they commit a homicide, well, their life is potentially over.
Yes.
In that sense, right? Or they could be subjected to more violence. So,
yes.
You need to humanize, and I don't know if empathy is the right word. It gets thrown around a lot, but you need to
something like it.
You need to have some respect for the person that is having that sanction placed against them, that has their best interests in mind as well as that of society, right?
Totally. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think, again, we viscerally drift towards backward-looking punishment.
Yeah.
It's like, well, they committed the crime. They deserve to be punished. Like, but why exactly? Like, well, they did a bad thing, but why? Like, well, they had a bad upbringing? Their neurons didn't fire in the right way? We see them as a person that doesn't have control. Like, well, if you don't see them as a person that doesn't have control, then you're like, well, maybe we should be removing them from society. Maybe we should try to rehabilitate them. But to try to get, I guess I'm sympathetic, as I said, to get rid of that visceral, I want to punish someone for being evil, which I really think is incoherent. Just to quickly share, Dennett gave the analogy of sports. Dennett is often good with his analogies. This time we'll say it's baseball, or it could be tennis, doesn't matter. The idea here is that if you're going to play the game of baseball, everyone agrees on what the rules are. And if you don't follow the rules, you don't play the game. Or if you violate the rules, you get punishment. Sure. Right? And maybe even, I guess hockey is another example, because you're literally sent to the penalty box if you've done something wrong.
Yep. You feel great shame.
Yeah, some of them do. Some of them get rewarded by your team. But the point is, everyone accepts this is the way it is. And while you're playing the game, as an excuse for why you've done, say, worse, you don't say, oh, that person had better genetics than me. Right? They don't usually, I mean, this is probably true, right? Yeah. That person had this bug, that person had this advantage, right? And then Dennett would also say, like, well, when we have umpires, when we're thinking about how to treat criminals, the umpire doesn't think like, well, how would this affect the broader society when I make this call? Right? Would it be better for this team to win? Would that bring more happiness to the fan? No, they don't do this. They follow the rules. And Dennett's point is that if you don't follow the rules, society would just reject it. And you can't have a game or life, you can't play the game of life, so to speak, the Moral Agents Club, without having the rules, without following it, and everything would fall apart.
Well, yeah. So in a game, the umpire or the ref or whoever it is, if that person, that authority, is seen as fairly instilling and following those rules and applying them, then people will follow those rules. And it's the same in society, right? If the police and the justice system fairly, transparently, consistently applies rules, there's a better confidence in that system and reduces crime, and all sorts of good things can happen. And for sure, that's not totally true in a lot of places.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. So overall summary of thoughts about the book is that I'm happy to have read it, and it's a much richer work for having them each contrast and discuss each other's views. Most of the time I read a book by just one author, or if they're co-authors, they agree. They're writing the same book. And I think each side of Dennett and Caruso, they become less persuasive, but in a useful way, because someone has disagreed or questioned things throughout their presentation of their ideas. That said, it might not be the introductory text I would offer someone if they are interested in the free will discussion. Elbow Room by Dennett is a really great book. It's like 30 years old, but I still think it's great as it dismantles deterministic threats. If one is looking for a good philosophical start, please try that one. Then perhaps Sam Harris's Free Will. It's shorter, it's good, it's straightforward, it's not overtly deep or philosophically sophisticated. And I think Sam Harris is often a good place to start, but please don't stop with him. And then this book, Just Desserts, might be for those who are willing to keep going. And if you want, you could even watch a talk that I gave years ago about free will and choice and that sort of thing. We can link it in the show notes at trcpodcast.com.
Great website.
Finally, I've often thought that thinking about and discussing free will is one of my favorite things, but this book might have cured me from that. So it's not to be that smarmy, but you realize sometimes like, oh, this is far more complicated, and I'll have to start reading journal articles to have better opinions about this stuff.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the general format of the book? I assume they didn't sit on a stage for like 40 hours and then this wasn't just transcribed. They wrote a series of letters that went back and forth? Or?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly the methodology. I know they had an exchange, which I assume were emails that went back and forth, which were then collected into sort of one conversation, which was put out in a publication. And then this book was expanded into having a second and third exchange, so to speak.
Okay.
My thought is, yes, they emailed each other. And it wasn't like a chat, but you could imagine a back and forth where I couldn't help but think like, well, someone probably waited longer. Maybe they had a nap. Maybe they had a snack between the responses.
Yep.
Other times you could imagine someone getting exasperated and then they kind of reset like, all right, we're still trying to have a nice debate and so on. So I would be curious exactly the methodology and how long it took them and for which exchanges, but it didn't say.
Yeah, I sort of wondered like, this would be interesting in audio, but you can't just have the two authors repeat it in audio because then they're not going to have the same reaction as they might have had when they originally stated these ideas and things like that, right? Because they're not actors, they're philosophers, right?
Yes.
It'd be interesting. So I don't know how they would tackle that if it ever does go to audio.
Yeah, you'd want to just revise what you've said because now you know what the other person's going to say. Well,
and you're not allowed.
Somewhat relatedly, Michael Shermer had both of them on, and there was a 2-hour discussion, and that had similarities and the same problems with this debate, but it's worse because it's a conversation. This is at least structured, right?
Yes.
Like as much as this had problems going back and forth and not defining things, at least you can read it in a somewhat narrative flow. As you can imagine, conversation, it's all over the place. Mm-hmm. They do have a website, which is also trcpodcast.com, debatingfreewill.com, where you can fill out a Google poll, which says like, did you read the book? What did you think? Who do you thought made the better case? Did you agree with this? Did you agree with that? And I did that. I thought, well, that's a good idea. Because why don't we actually take some sort of a survey and get some data on who might have won this debate?
Yeah. Which doesn't necessarily mean a certain idea is better than the other, but there's a lot of factors there.
Or quite frankly, that someone's not going to scam the poll. And then they
Dennett's logging in with a bunch of IPs.
He's like, Gregg doesn't think I should be punished for this. Ha ha.
That'll show him that evil man.
That's a good ending.
All right.
Until next time, think better, to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.